I got a summer job during high school after my grandmother passed away, helping maintain the local cemetery. It wasn't the most glamorous gig, but it gave me a chance to keep her gravesite tidy, which felt important. And they paid a little extra if you filled in graves after burials, so I took it. The work started early before the summer heat kicked in, and the mornings were quiet, just me, the mist, and rows of weathered headstones. Well, one morning as the sun started cutting through the fog, I was walking the grounds shovel in hand, when I noticed a figure up ahead. It was a man walking a dog. At first I thought it might be my grandfather, as he's big on rescuing greyhounds and often walked them in the mornings. We lived relatively nearby, so it wouldn't be unusual for him to be there. I called out waving, but he didn't respond. That struck me as odd. I started walking towards him, trying to get a better look, and as I got closer, the man and dog just disappeared. One moment they were there, the next, they weren't. There was no fading into the distance, no sound. They were simply gone. I stopped dead in my tracks, blinking and looking around like maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. The place was already eerie enough without people and dogs vanishing into thin air, and I stood there baffled for a moment. That was when I saw it. An albino deer, pure white against the grey of the morning. It stepped out from between the graves like something out of a dream. It walked so close to me I could have reached out and touched it, but the thing didn't even look my way and just kept moving, unbothered by my presence. It was an unsettling experience. Now, maybe the disappearing man and the deer were just two strange but unrelated events. But when something like that happens in a cemetery, it makes you think. I worked at this graveyard for a few months. It was a very chill gig. Most of the time I was just cutting grass, tidying up, that sort of thing. But one day, the crew who was digging the grave left early, leaving the big old excavator parked up near the hole. I'm on my lunch break near the machine when I hear this banging. And I'm not talking about some little clank or creak. This was like someone going to town with a sledgehammer on the excavator. At first, I assumed someone was just back there fixing something. But the banging kept on going, for 7 minutes. I was thinking, okay, this is mad weird. So I finally get up to check it out. I walk over thinking I'm about to catch someone messing about, but as soon as I get close, boom, silence. Like someone hit mute button on reality. I'm looking around, checking inside the cab, under the machine, behind it. Literally no one there. Not a soul. Just me. Standing there like a muppet, trying to figure out what the hell just happened. It gets better. I live just down the road from this cemetery, and obviously pass it all the time. Well, one night I'm getting home a bit late, and as I'm driving by, I see this woman wandering around the headstones. It's past midnight, pitch black, and she's just roaming, with no torch, no rush, just floating around like she owned the place. The spookiness captured in those few moments as I saw her were intense. I couldn't tell if she was a real person or not, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. Between the haunted excavator and the late-night graveyard ghosts, that place was giving me big nope energy. This happened a while back. One foggy evening, my son Caleb and I had a strange experience that I still can't quite explain. I'd just finished a rough day at work, collected Caleb from school, and we were both pretty drained. He was quite upset. His chemistry teacher had been giving him a hard time because he didn't want to pair up with someone for a project. You see, Caleb's quite a shy kid, avoids crowds and pretty much only feels fully comfortable around me. To cheer him up, I offered to take him to his favourite place, Applebee's, but to my surprise, he asked if we could visit my friend Ali's grave instead. For context, she was my best friend who passed away before Caleb was even born, and it felt like a good idea. So we stopped at a store, grabbed some flowers, and headed to the cemetery. By the time we got there, the sky was overcast and the fog was starting to loom. And as soon as I stepped out of the car, I had this strange feeling come over me, like someone was watching us. Caleb felt it too. He was actually trembling a little bit. He said he felt really nervous but couldn't explain why, and I wondered if it was because of the hard day he'd had at school. We began walking to my friend's grave, flowers in hand, and as we passed through the rows of headstones, Caleb suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, staring at something in the distance and asking if I just saw that woman. He pointed towards a large tree in the distance. I looked, but didn't see anything. She just went behind that tree. I squinted, saw nothing, but nonetheless, given the atmosphere, it sent a chill down my spine. "Let's just put the flowers on Ellie's grave and head home," I said to him. When we reached Ellie's grave, Caleb knelt, placed his flowers, and said a prayer. He was visibly emotional, and seeing him like that brought tears to my own eyes, especially since he never even met Ellie. I set down my flowers, whispered to Ellie how much I missed her, and the grief hit hard. We said our goodbyes and began heading back to the car. The fog was worse now. It had gotten to the point where it was very hard to see pretty much anything other than a few meters in front of us, so I grabbed his hand to keep us together. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to sound calm for his sake. And that's when we saw them. 3 shadows emerged in the fog, unmoving, blocking our path. I yelled out, "Who's there?" But there was no response. That's when Caleb, my quiet, shy boy, stepped out in front and shouted to leave us alone. But the shadows didn't move. I couldn't tell if they were people or something else entirely, and Caleb grabbed my hand and pulled me forward, urging me to run. He led us through the fog, moving quickly, though we couldn't see really where we were going. That's when I heard whispers, soft, unintelligible, and we didn't stop until we got back in the car. Just as we were getting in, and I was trying to reverse out of the parking lot, that's when we both saw a woman in a long gown with long brown hair step around near a gravesite. She was looking right at us. Caleb said that was the same woman he'd seen near the tree. I didn't want to find out more, so I hit the gas and we sped out of there. And as you can probably imagine, we haven't been back since. A long time ago now, during my great-grandfather's funeral, something strange happened to me. The service was held at an old church, which had a graveyard running through the path from the street to the church itself. There were graves, some over 50 years old, and the whole place had quite a creepy vibe. After the funeral service had ended, my mother and I were walking along the path through the graveyard to leave. As we passed the old grave, something shiny caught my eye. Curious, I stepped closer and saw it. There was a ring lying there on the ground near one of the graves. Now, I had always had a thing for rings and chains, though my mother never let me wear them. Without thinking twice, I secretly picked up the precious and slipped it into my pants pocket, figuring no one would notice. We left the church and headed to the family residence to pay our respects and spend time with relatives. While we were there, a strange feeling came over me, like I needed to tell someone about the ring. So I casually mentioned to my mother that I'd picked up a ring from the graveyard. Her reaction was harsh. She was furious. She scolded me for taking something from the graveyard and insisted I rid myself of it immediately. Scared and full of regret, I left the house, walked to the street, and threw the ring in the gutter. I watched it fall into the water and get carried away before heading back inside. Later, we finished our visit, returned home, both of us mentally and emotionally exhausted. I went to my room to change, and out of habit, checked my pants pockets for tissues or anything that I had forgotten. That's when my heart nearly stopped. In my right pocket was the ring. I froze, my hand trembling, as I pulled out the precious. I could feel my chest tightening with fear. I knew I had thrown it in the gutter. I had watched it disappear, and yet, here it was. My mother's warning echoed in my head. You should never take anything from a graveyard. Panic set in, but I didn't want to scare her, so I decided to fix the situation myself. I got dressed, grabbed the ring, and rushed out the house to the nearby church. I didn't go near the graveyard this time. Instead, I placed the ring at the statue of Mother Mary, whispering a desperate prayer for forgiveness. I stood there for 10 long minutes, hoping it would be enough to end whatever was happening. When I finally returned home, I checked my pockets again, and this time the ring was gone for good. Even now, the memory still makes me feel creeped out. Maybe some will believe me, maybe others won't, but for me it was the scariest experience of my life, and it taught me the lesson to never take anything from a graveyard. Back when I lived on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, our neighborhood was surrounded by graves of native Hawaiians. The area carried a deep sense of history, but as kids we didn't think much of it. Me, my brother, and a friend, being the reckless little idiots we were, decided one night to go ghost hunting around those graves. Behind my house there was this open field dotted with some of the graves. Off to the side of the house there was a small parking area. That spot was infamous in the neighborhood, known for paranormal experiences and rumored sightings of the night marchers, spirits of ancient Hawaiian warriors said to roam the land. It was between 8 and 9. The streetlights were on, casting enough light to make everything feel eerie, and we wandered out there with no real plan, asking questions into the night air, trying to communicate with whatever may be listening. While we were standing near the parking space, one of the streetlights right next to us suddenly shut off. Just that one. No flickering, no other lights going out, just that specific lamp. It was such a clear, deliberate action that the three of us froze. My friend broke the silence, saying, "Let's go, man, I'm kinda scared." That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, this deep, calm, and chilling voice said, "Relax." It wasn't any of us. There was no one else around. The voice didn't echo. It was just there, like it materialized out of the air. We didn't stick around to figure out what it meant. We bolted back inside, hearts pounding, and for a while nothing happened, and we thought we'd escaped unscathed. About 2 weeks later, things started getting weird at home. The first thing we noticed was cold smoke appearing in the kitchen at random times. It didn't come from the stove or anywhere else we could find, it just hung in the air, vanishing as suddenly as it arrived. Then came the disturbances in my room. I'd wake up between 2 and 4 a.m. to find my lights on, even though I always turned them off before bed. It wasn't every night, but when it happened, it was always in that same time window. Our dogs began acting strangely too. Late at night, usually around the same time, he'd bark at the back door, growling like he was seeing something we could not. It all felt connected. The voices by the graves, the weird occurrences in the house. It was as if something had followed us back. Looking back now, I'm convinced that night wasn't just a coincidence. Whatever we disturbed out there clearly decided to let us know it wasn't happy. It was autumn in 2015 and I was 23 years old. During that time I lived in Lancaster, as I was studying at Lancaster University. For those who are not familiar, Lancaster is a small and rather quaint town in the north of England. As a student, you could either live at the university campus or in private accommodation in the town. I had decided to live in a newly built, renovated apartment in the nice side of town. I had already been studying for 2 years and had reached my 3rd year. By this time I'd grown accustomed to the layout of the town and felt comfortable and safe living there semi-independently, with 2 other friends who were also studying at the time. Since my 1st year, I had decided to improve my fitness by taking nightly runs around either the campus or the town. As we were living in the town centre by my 3rd year, I would run either with my housemates or alone. The important thing to note about Lancaster, and this will be important later, is that it has quite a large residential area that is hilly and far removed from the bustling centre, which at the time was a hub for the students or the local northern folk, probably drinking in pubs or eating pears. Occasionally I'd run with my housemates, however I preferred to run alone and listen to some kind of heavy metal, a big fan of Deftones during that period. And on this particular day, as I said, a chilly autumnal evening, I had decided to run alone. It was about 8 PM and I had my earphones in. I had started to run up to the more isolated districts that led up to a very pretty residential area and a large green called Williamson Park. Next to the park was a very large graveyard, the kind that is miles wide and has different areas, large yew trees, crumbling graves, a crypt in the centre overrun with leaves and ivy. But what was especially creepy about this particular cemetery was that it had the ruin of an old mental asylum on the other side. You could actually sneak in if you walked across the width of the cemetery and crawled through a small hole in the fence that led to the asylum grounds. This was not advised though, as guard dogs roamed the derelict building. It was not a place you'd want to be in at night. So I had made my way past Williamson Park and up to the entrance of the graveyard. Immediately my eye was drawn to something small standing at the imposing gates of the graveyard. They were kind of tall, black iron gates that were at the bottom of a little winding path. I felt a little apprehensive, but it wasn't unusual to see people walking their dogs, etc. out of the graveyard, so I started to slow my pace and walk in the direction of the shape. As I drew nearer, I realized the shape was a child of around 9 to 10. They were running towards me frantically. They looked panicked and scared, and I think they were crying. I vividly remember the girl was not wearing a coat, only a thin dress that would not be suitable for the harsh Lancastrian autumn. She asked me if I could help her. She was desperate and seemed to be frightened of something. She kept looking back at the graveyard, which at this point was totally pitch black beyond the gates. I mean, there was absolutely no light beyond the path. As the graveyard was quite large, it was chilling to see the depth of the blackness and the vulnerable child standing at the mouth of the gate, helpless. I don't recall what the girl said exactly, but I then offered to call the local police. I had punched 999 into my phone and had it on speaker. The girl immediately changed. She wasn't happy about the fact I was calling the police, that was clear. She stopped crying and seemed angry, almost demanding, and insisted she did not need help from the police. I reassured her that it was best to inform the police, even offered to walk her to the station, which was about 20 minutes back down the hill. That's when the story gets a little weird and a bit terrifying. The girl turned and ran back to the graveyard. She ran directly through the gates and into the eerie blackness. She didn't turn back, she just ran quickly as possible until she'd completely disappeared. It was then totally silent. I was spooked beyond belief, now standing in the darkened street completely alone. Who was the girl? Why was she alone? Why was she scared of the police? And why wasn't she frightened of the dark? Who might she be running to or from? I turned and ran all the way back down the hill, not stopping until I reached a well-lit built-up area. Safe to say, I didn't run on my own at night again. It's a mystery that's plagued me ever since. The little girl in the graveyard. Growing up and still to this day, I have loved the spooky and scary things. Supernatural and paranormal stories were my favourite to read and watch, no matter how much it frightened me. I was obsessed with ghosts and cemeteries and all things creepy, and the adrenaline of the fright. So when a teenage me was offered to play hide and seek in the largest very haunted graveyard in my city, I said yes. The graveyard was run by the church that it surrounded, a decent-sized cathedral surrounded by a mile of graves each way. My friend and I had planned to go on a day we knew no one would be there to kick us out for playing among the graves. The week leading up to us playing the game, it had been storming, bringing cold air down after a heat wave. And the day we went was the first day that week that it hadn't rained. Wet or not, we had to go now or wait another week of storms. Because of the chill the rain brought, the thick fog had set over the city. It was perfect for a spooky game of hide and seek in a graveyard. We all met up at my best friend's house, John, as he lived not even 3 full blocks away from the place. Now, John also loved the paranormal like I did, except he was also a huge scaredy cat, so when we went it couldn't be at night. It was barely past noon when we started that way. A common friend of ours, Hannah, who also came up with the idea, and my boyfriend Greg at the time were the 2 other people to play this game. Greg was a comfort for John, as Greg was and still is a skeptic of all things. We didn't have much trouble getting in, and after a long minute of walking we made it to the cathedral. It was still decently bright outside for being a cloudy day with thick fog, but the graveyard made everything feel darker. Maybe it was because it was littered with many trees and there were graves, or maybe it was because we were superstitious, but either way, John and I came down with bad feelings. While Hannah explained how she would be the seeker first since she came up with the idea, John whispered in my ear about his bad feeling. Admitting to him about mine, though, would have only scared him more, and really wanting to do this with everyone, I told him not to worry while I pushed my own instincts aside. Anything for the adrenaline, right? And if anyone sees a ghost, make sure you record it, Hannah said. Greg rolled his eyes, not saying anything, but he was right. Almost everyone in our city had a personal scary story about this graveyard specifically, but no one had ever provided any evidence. And as if a bunch of professionals wouldn't capture anything, I doubted 4 teenagers would. I was about to ask her if it was the point of us gathering here when John pulled on my shirt and asked if everyone had heard a noise. He said it was like a little girl laughing. Hannah laughed excitedly, telling us the story of the little kids rumored to haunt the place, but they are just a few of the many entities there. She happily announced this to the group. John was going to say something else, but Hannah clapped her hands and told us to disperse while she turned around and began to count. John gave me a pleading look, but I returned it with an encouraging smile and took off. I was hoping Greg would follow me, as we could have a little fun of our own while waiting to be found, but Greg was a competitive person, so if he was playing a game, he was playing a game. I hid behind a few trees, a few large graves, always being respectful of where I stepped, before I found the perfect spot behind a mausoleum. Those small buildings for multiple graves, usually no bigger than 5'5". The front part faced the main path of the graveyard, but the other 3 sides had large bushes, almost as tall as the thing itself, and with just enough space between the building and the bush for me to hide in. They weren't that thick, but they do a decent job. It actually could have fit at least 6 people without touching each other in the back. It was one of those spots that was so obvious someone would hide there that the seeker would look past it because it was just too obvious, if that made sense. There were maybe 5 minutes before I heard someone walking towards me, and I crouched really low so they wouldn't see me standing there behind the bush. I couldn't see too well, but I could see that the person walking was a guy. When he got close enough, I heard Greg whisper my name. I guessed he probably had similar thoughts to me, however I was hiding. He didn't know where I was hiding, and he was walking past the bushes where I could easily and quietly follow him to jump out and scare him. Yes, it would have given me away, and he probably would scream, but a jump scare in thick fog in a graveyard is too good a chance to pass. It was like I was being handed the perfect scare on a silver platter. I crept down, walking in a sort of duck walk, following Greg next to him, ready to jump out in front of the bush on the main road. Just as he started to turn and come around the front of the thing, I sprang up and yelled, "Boo!" I could feel the smile fall from my face, but I was met with nothing. There was no scream, no surprise, no reaction of any sort, as Greg wasn't standing there. In fact, no one was standing there. I remember looking around confused, but seeing nobody. Not even someone trying to hide as a prank on me. Something cold passed through me. Then I shivered. Maybe I should find a different spot. And so 10 minutes later, I was in a new spot, tucked in between a grave and a tree directly behind it. I kept peering around to make sure if I saw someone, they didn't see me. It was maybe 2 minutes, if that, when I heard crunching of the gravel that made up the pathways. I peeked over the grave and saw Hannah and John walking on one path over, meaning 6 rows of graves in between the path in front of me and the path they were on. I quietly giggled watching them look behind or up the trees, as if any of us would climb them, and talking to each other. "Greg," Hannah called out, followed by my name, like she was taunting us to come out. Didn't she know the rules of the game? I jerked my leg back when I felt something touch it. I was relieved to see it was just a leaf that scraped against me. Hannah and John were now further away, still walking away from me, and I had the brilliant idea to follow them. I figured they'd never suspect to look behind them. I had just taken a step when something full-on grabbed my ankle and pulled. I'm not sure how it happened, but when it pulled, at the same time, I looked down to see what it was. But when the pull knocked my balance off, I fell, and my head collided with the grave right above my eyes. But it wasn't done when I was on the ground. My vision was blurring and I couldn't see what it was, but something started dragging me. I was on my stomach screaming, pulling up grass and weeds, trying to find something to grip. Hannah and John weren't even out of sight when I went down, and I knew they'd hear me. They'd come running to help, but they didn't. Finally, my fingers caught on the edge of one of those plaque graves, the ones where the stone lays flat on the ground. There wasn't much help, but it provided me enough of an edge to pull up against whatever was pulling me, and it let go. I don't know if my vision was blurry from hitting my head or from my tears, but I saw nothing and scrambled up quickly, running in the last direction I saw someone. However, when I started running, something else did too, following close behind me. I found Greg first, basically running smack dab into him, who was panicking and looking over me. He told me he heard my screams and ran as fast as he could to get to me, and asked me why my shirt pants were covered in mud and if I knew my forehead was bleeding. None of that mattered to me though, because something was chasing me, and I had said as much, but Greg assured me when he saw me running towards him no one was behind me. Game or not, we were done. We went to find Hannah and John. Greg took my hand and I remember crying the entire way, telling Greg that the last direction I saw them going was over there. It didn't take us long to find them, and an even shorter time for us to leave. Greg didn't fully believe me when I told him what happened, but he knew me well enough to know that I don't scare easily. He wouldn't say it was a ghost, but he was adamant it was something. His thoughts were more along the lines of a crazy hobo. Hannah was pissed. She was mad I didn't pull my phone out and record anything, and got even more upset when I sarcastically apologized because reaching for my phone was the least of my concerns, which she countered with, "You should have been recording the whole time like me." Yeah, we aren't really friends anymore. John didn't say anything to me besides if I was okay and what could be done to help me. It wasn't until after I was okay that he let me know he had been upset with me. I guess he wasn't alright with me brushing off his concerns and then turning around and getting attacked. Karma or irony, I guess. I had gotten a concussion from slamming my head on the grave, but no other damage, and it was another 2 months after before I even looked at what Hannah had recorded. I still wish I hadn't though. Almost as clear as day, you can see my little head way off, popping up behind the grave, and just behind me, where a huge-ass tree was supposed to be, was a very tall and dark figure lurking over me. Then they continued walking. The camera was slightly swaying back and forth, meaning they weren't really holding it up to record anything, but it still could have picked up my screams. It didn't. In fact, you couldn't hear anything, not even Hannah and John talking, just kind of like a white static noise. Hannah eventually sent the footage to our city's local paranormal investigation team, who took one look and claimed it was fake. It's been years, but every time I drive by that graveyard, I feel that thing staring at me, waiting for me to come back inside, but I haven't. I haven't gone into any cemetery or graveyard since, and if you go to one, make sure you respect the dead. I want to share a very spooky encounter with you. Though it's not as intense as my grandfather's encounters, I still would like your take on it. So there's local folklore about the man-eating demon called the Pishash, ghouls in our village. It's said that they live in graveyards and eat the flesh of dead humans who didn't live righteous lives. but sometimes they take the form of a beautiful woman or a crying child to attract people at night, and then eat them instead. It's a pretty well-known story. We've been hearing it since childhood, though I personally didn't believe it. I think jinns exist, but they can't hurt humans, at least not in normal circumstances. But on to the story. One day I went to see a performance in a neighbouring village with my friend Armin. By the time the performance ended, it was almost midnight. We started coming back home, and on the way back, we had to cross an old graveyard. It was one of the biggest paranormal hotspots in our village. We were talking about the performance the whole time until we reached the graveyard. That's when both of us went quiet. We had crossed this road hundreds of times, never this late at night though, and our bodies felt heavy as we crossed it. Every noise felt like it could be paranormal in nature, and each step felt slower than the last. Suddenly we heard a faint noise. As we walked down the road, the sound became louder and clearer. It was the cry of a child. Of course, we had run into a ghoul. I felt like crying. I looked beside me. Armin was just as scared. The most terrifying thing is the fact that we heard it. It meant it was already aware of our presence. As we slowly approached the sound, we saw a child of about 2 crying beside the road. We didn't even look at it. As we walked by it, my eyes started tearing up, and every cell in my body was telling me to flee. I barely managed to keep myself together. I would have probably passed out if I were alone from the fear. As we went past the crying, it became louder and louder, to the point where it felt my eardrum would burst. Once we were about 20 meters away from it, the crying stopped, and I could no longer control myself and ended up looking back. When I did, I saw nothing. It was gone. There wasn't any sign of it around. So I took a deep breath and my heart felt lighter. Armin looked at me. He was also relieved. But before we could say a single word, we heard what I can only describe as a demonic scream from the graveyard. And then we ran as fast as we could. We didn't stop until we reached our village. There were a few people sitting beside a campfire playing cards, and the moment we reached them, I passed out. I woke up in my grandparents' home. Armin had already woken up, and he told them everything. I confirmed his claims. We saw a Pishach. We really did. Some believed us, others did not, and I got an earful from my grandmother. It's been 3 years since then, and we still talk about it when I go back to the village during vacations. I still wonder what would have happened to me had I been alone at the time. Maybe I wouldn't be here sharing this story, but I'm never using that road at night again. This happened back when I was a teenager in the mid-90s. I worked at a Friday fish fry restaurant in Wisconsin. After shifts, my coworker and I had this tradition of hanging out in a nearby cemetery, crammed into a 1984 Chevy conversion van. It was a strange but harmless way to unwind. We weren't drinking or doing drugs, just regular teen stuff. Mug, root beer, Doritos, a bit of gossip, and maybe some light flirting. It was innocent fun. The kind of thing that made you feel invincible and alive. One summer night, though, everything changed. We were parked in our usual spot, laughing and munching on snacks. Most of the group was in the back of the van, but I'd moved up to the front passenger to stretch out a bit. As I sat there staring out the windshield, I noticed something odd. A faint white mist forming in the distance. At first, I didn't say anything. It could have been anything, fog, headlights, my imagination. But as I kept watching, the mist started to take shape. It wasn't random or natural looking anymore. Slowly, it formed into the outline of a man riding one of those old-timey bicycles, the kind with a massive front wheel and a tiny one in the back. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It all happened so fast, but it felt like time slowed down. The figure wasn't just riding aimlessly. It turned its head and looked directly at me, its eyes locked with mine, and that's when everything shifted. The man's face transformed into something terrifying, twisted, demonic, with an open, snarling jaw. Before I could even process it, the apparition shot straight at me like a bullet coming from around 30 yards away. It was as if this thing was targeting me. Just before it reached the van, it dissolved back into a white mist. and veered sharply to the side. That's when a loud bang exploded from the passenger side of the van as the mist passed. It wasn't just me who heard it, everyone in the van jumped at the sound. The whole group, 4 of us in total, went silent for a moment, startled and confused. When I finally managed to speak, I told them what I'd seen. My hands were visibly shaking, heart pounding. But instead of believing me, they thought I'd been playing a prank. They accused me of banging on the side of the van to scare them. I got it. I was the kind of guy who loved to joke around, but this time I wasn't kidding. I couldn't have faked what had just happened. Still, the unease in the van was palpable to the boy who cried wolf and everyone else. Even if they didn't believe me, they knew something wasn't right. We all agreed to leave pretty quickly after that, and on the drive home I couldn't shake the feeling that we disrespected a sacred space. To this day, my old friends bring up that night, usually to tease me and ask if I'm finally ready to admit it was a joke. But it wasn't. I'm convinced of what I saw and heard. Whether or not people believe me, though, doesn't really matter to me. It's a memory that will stay with me forever. I know what happened. In the fall of 2006, I visited Savannah, Georgia, a city renowned for its ghost stories and historic charm, as part of my trip. I joined one of the city's famous ghost tours. I was only 13 at the time, and while I didn't necessarily believe in ghosts, I was curious and excited to see what the night had in store. The tour eventually took us to a graveyard, which I think might have been Colonial Park Cemetery. It was dark by then, but there was just enough light, maybe from the nearby street lamps or lanterns carried by the guide, to see faint details of our surroundings. The guide was animated, sharing chilling tales about the people buried there and the cemetery's storied past. I was standing with the group, hanging on her every word when something caught my eye. From behind the tour guide I saw what looked like a pair of legs and feet casually walking. At first I thought it might have been another person on the tour, but something was off. The legs didn't belong to a full figure. It was as if the torso and head were missing entirely. What struck me were that the boots were old, like something from a soldier from the 1700s. They didn't shine or reflect the dim light like modern shoes might. They were dull and worn, almost out of place in present day. The figure walked calmly, almost too calm, out from behind the guide and passed through the area before vanishing into thin air. I just froze. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. My brain was struggling to process what I had just witnessed. When I finally snapped out of it, my first instinct was to grab my camera, but it was too late. The figure was gone. I glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed, but no one seemed fazed. The guide continued her story, and the other tourists remained focused on her, completely unaware of what I'd seen. I wanted to say something, to point out what I'd just witnessed, but I hesitated. What if they didn't believe me? What if they thought I was making it up? The idea of being dismissed or laughed at kept me quiet, but I decided to keep the experience to myself. Looking back, that moment changed my perspective entirely. I went from being a skeptic to having no doubts about the existence of the paranormal. It wasn't just a flicker of light. I could explain that away, but I saw the boots, I saw the legs clear as day, and they vanished like they were never there. Over the years, I've tried to find others who might have experienced the same thing. I've combed through reviews of Savannah ghost tours, hoping someone else might describe something similar, but I've come up empty. Savannah has its fair share of ghost stories and paranormal reports, but I've never come across anyone mentioning that particular figure. In Texas, just outside of Houston, there's a suburban community with a dark and unusual history. Built in the 1970s, the neighborhood sits on land that was once an 1800s graveyard. Instead of relocating the bodies, the developers removed only the gravestones, leaving the human remains undisturbed. Over time, as the community expanded, residents began uncovering graves, some as recently as 2 or 3 years ago. If you venture into the nearby forest leading to the lake, you might stumble upon an old gravestone or two. This is the backdrop of my story, as in 2019 I bought my first home in this community, completely unaware of its eerie past. My wife and I were thrilled to settle into our new home, and whether or not our real estate agent knew about the land's history, it was never mentioned to us. For the first year, everything was normal, life was peaceful, and that's when things started to change. In 2020, my wife became pregnant with our first child, and we were ecstatic preparing for the baby's arrival and outfitting the nursery. One day, as I was about to assemble the crib, I carried the heavy box from the garage to the door, struggling to open it while balancing the weight. The door suddenly flew open on its own. At first, I assumed my wife had opened it for me, but she wasn't there. She was still in the nursery. What made it stranger was the door's weight. It was a solid, heavy door that normally closed on its own. It wasn't a windy day either. I thought it was odd, but brushed it off at the time. The next incident involved my wife, and after a long day I was relaxing in the shower while she began to cook dinner. Suddenly she burst into the bathroom, visibly shaken. She explained that she had seen a shadow heading towards the nursery and assumed it was me. She had started talking to it, confused when I didn't respond, only to realize no one was there. Over time, small unexplained things started happening. Items would move from their usual spots, but we chalked it up to forgetfulness, at least at first. It wasn't until I decided to rent out that house and buy another within the same community that I learnt about its history. A potential renter casually mentioned the old graveyard and the lawsuits tied to it. Intrigued, I began researching and even discovered an old Unsolved Mysteries episode that detailed the community's experiences. It turns out that when the developers took over the graveyard, it was deemed abandoned, leaving no legal liability for the construction. When we moved into the second house, the strange occurrences started almost immediately. By this time, we had a 6-month-old baby and a toddler, and one evening while my wife and I were in the living room with our toddler, we heard a loud noise. A ball from the playpen had somehow flown out of the master bedroom and hit the wall with force. Both of us saw it happen. We tried to rationalize it, checking for air currents, loose toys, or any plausible explanation, but came up empty. Then, there's the curious behavior of our 2-year-old daughter who's autistic. At exactly 3 a.m. without fail, she wakes up and wants to sleep with us. Sometimes she's frightened, other times she's perfectly calm. I'm unsure if it's learnt behavior or something more, but it feels significant. Beyond that, my wife and I have both had unsettling experiences. We frequently see shadows or dark masses from the corner of our eyes. My wife often feels uneasy in the kitchen, and I've had fleeting moments where I'm convinced I saw movement, only for it to vanish when I look directly at it. To be clear, I'm not definitely calling these things paranormal. There's always the possibility of imagination, paranoia, or coincidence. If there is something at play, it doesn't seem malicious. But I'm left to wonder about the history of the land and the lingering effects of what lies beneath it. I suppose before I start, I need to give you some context, as the story is rather long. Me and my boyfriend at the time had the very definition of a toxic relationship. If I were to write everything out, it would probably be the dictionary definition. He was a piece of work. I was a very insecure person, and he would constantly cheat on me, and we'd always argue, and I'd always forgive him because I'd be afraid that I would be alone. To my own undoing, I suppose. I did eventually learn my lesson, but that's not the story I wanted to share with you today, no. This happened when he took me out for my 25th birthday. I was very excited. He had booked a romantic getaway at a beach resort, and I was thrilled. He hadn't done anything this romantic in a number of years, and I suppose, given his latest escapade, it was a way to make up for the spout of cheating he'd been up to, and I was more inclined to forgive with this kind gesture. To cut a long story short, we got to the beach resort and he had organised, for my birthday day itself, which happened to be a Saturday, a lovely evening meal in a nearby restaurant. We went to the nearby restaurant, had the meal, but he kept eyeing up the waitress, which was really getting on my nerves. I try to talk to him about it, and he tells me I'm being manipulative and overreacting. Things escalate that by the time we get to the hotel room, we have a full-on blowout, and him insisting that because he paid for the weekend, effectively kicks me out on my birthday out of the hotel room. He had taken the card key away, so I was furious. I didn't know if the hotel receptionist would give me another key, and I went for a walk to try and cool off. I was absolutely livid. I was crying, and my phone had been left in my purse, which of course was in the hotel room, which I couldn't access. So I just went for a wander. It must have been around 9 or 10 p.m. at the time. I can't say for certain as I didn't wear a watch. And as I'd been walking a little bit further away from the hotel, the area started to get perceptibly more run down. I reached a bridge with a body of water underneath and decided to just sit by the water and listen. I made my way down the bank when I heard some motorbikes roaring up ahead and above me. I sat quietly listening when I heard a few of the men get off their bikes and shout they were looking for the girl and that they should try and grab her and cycle off with her. I wasn't sure if they were referring to me, but that gave me seriously creepy vibes, and I hid and tried to make myself even smaller under the bridge, unsure if I had just escaped being taken or something. That was making me feel quite unsafe, and I sat there for what must have been a good while. When I finally felt it was okay to poke my head out, I looked around and couldn't see anyone. I saw a sign for a local cemetery that caught my eye that was en route back to the hotel. I started walking that way. It wasn't before long that I made it there. It was quite a well-kept cemetery, a bit small, with a church at the very end, and I decided to go in and just to sit down casually to pay my respects to those who had passed on, and try to calm my emotions. I sat by one of the gravestones reading the names, not really sure what I was doing there, when I heard footsteps behind me. Instantly I assumed it was one of the biker people and ran without looking back towards the side of the church. When I reached it, like prey in the eye of a predator, I cautiously peeked out from behind the building and looked to see if there was anyone there. But there wasn't. Maybe they had gone already. I slumped down behind the building and was feeling quite tired. I'd also had a few drinks. The effect of the alcohol had mostly worn off from the anger, the walk and the fear, but I was certainly feeling tired, and as I sat down in the corner, I passed out. I woke up a few hours later. It was very dark now. The sky was out and there was a low mist among me. I was very, very cold and realized that I probably shouldn't be in a graveyard in the middle of the night. So I got up and looked around. I don't know why, but no streetlights were on. I was feeling very vulnerable, like I could be attacked. I could barely see anything. The church had one of those floodlights pointing towards the entrance, and that was my only way to see anything. I looked into the distance towards the road and told myself that must have been the way I came, and started to slowly make my way out of the cemetery. Just as I was walking along the path to leave, did I hear footsteps once again. This time, I told myself it must be someone there. They didn't feel fast, they just felt like someone walking behind me. And I casually turned my head to see if maybe there was a priest or someone. But of course, there was nothing. And when I looked behind me, the footsteps stopped. I rubbed my eyes, pressed my fingers in my ears, and asked myself, am I hearing things? And just as I was leaving the cemetery, did I hear one last clomp of feet. I didn't bother turning around this time. I had chills going all the way up my back and knew better than to look behind me. I eventually made my way back to the hotel lobby, and it was 3-something. The desk clerk was just on their phone and didn't even notice me come in. I slowly crept up to my room to see if it was unlocked, and of course it was still locked. So I asked him if he could make me a key, and he said he couldn't as I hadn't made the booking. And after a very long ordeal, he finally went up with me to open the door. My boyfriend wasn't even in. I don't even know where he went. But I passed out on the sofa, and in the morning got my things, he still wasn't there and left. I'm glad to say that from that day, I got a bit more of a backbone, and before long ended things with him. But that night in the cemetery still gives me the willies. This all happened a year and a half ago. It was around fall and it was cold. My partner and I decided to go to an old mining cave museum not far from where we lived, and it was roughly around an hour drive. Although our experience was the normal go to and head back home kind of thing, we were also told the museum had a gravesite, a grave memorial, while my ex-boyfriend and I went to check it out before we headed back home. The hike to the place was fairly close to the parking lot, but it was approximately a 20 to 30 minute walk. For our walk, we didn't really talk, rather just enjoy the trails and the streams down the small creek. During this walk, the distance between the mining museum and the gravesite seemed to be a lot more quiet than most historic mining sites. I remember it feeling calm and peaceful, but when we got closer to the gravesite, I had this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach that we weren't really alone that day. I remember butterflies in my gut, but feeling like we were being watched, more specifically me, since it was an open field. The grass was all there, but behind me, as I walked behind my ex-boyfriend, I felt as though I was being followed. I remembered my breath heaving in the air. It felt stuffy, it felt closed in. To me, I was getting sort of uncomfortable and rethinking my choice if we made the right call into finding this place. It felt like I was invading a space that wasn't even mine, and I felt unwelcomed. Since my ex was a huge skeptic about everything, he would always say that I was just overreacting, but this felt different. As we stopped near the gravesite, there were just the remains of an old gravestone. There wasn't much of it except where the workers flagged the site, marking it with yellow strands of plastic. During this time, I felt uneasy. The feeling wasn't going away. I felt like it was only affecting me more than my ex at the time. The feeling of a presence still lingered. I felt as if I was standing next to someone that wasn't there. More particularly, I felt watched. But I think I made the mistake of asking an open-ended question. We stood around the grave, and since my ex liked to read historic markers, we stayed there for another 30 minutes until we headed back into the parking lot. He didn't seem to be affected, but I sort of asked, "Is there anything here?" "You're welcome to follow us." I don't know what came over my head, but the presence, I felt like it wasn't going away. It felt like the whole walk towards the site the air changed, but after heading back the air felt and seemed lighter and normal. I wasn't heaving anymore, and I had stable breathing. I didn't feel anxious or nervous. Not until he drove me back to my place. I'm a deep sleeper, so if he made a noise I probably wouldn't notice, but that night I woke up with my soul almost leaving my body. It was around 3:30 a.m. I was sleeping, and that's when I had this feeling of someone watching me through the room. I woke up, my eyes were heavy, hoping to fall back asleep, but that didn't happen. That's when I heard something move off my closet shelf. I was startled. I saw my bag, almost the size of a suitcase, shuffle around. I thought it was my mother, since we share a room and she would always go to the bathroom late at night, but this time it wasn't her. As I watched the bag, it instantly fell on the ground. My mother, on the other hand, was dead asleep no matter how hard it hit the ground. I had this feeling the unknown presence was next to the lamp I had, and I looked to my left as I watched the lamp. As soon as I was staring at this invisible thing, I saw the lamp move, physically move out of place. It felt like it was angry. After the lamp physically moved, this gust of air came blowing out of nowhere. It was incredibly cold. I felt the whole room shake. My heart rate was beating so fast that not only did I experience air running through the room, or see my bag falling off the floor, I felt like it also tried to break the mirror hanging on the wall of my bedroom. As soon as all that happened, the room was quiet. The air in the room changed to what I had experienced earlier that day with my ex. My mother woke up, but she woke up too late to notice these things with the naked eye. To this day I don't know what followed me, but it sure made its presence into letting me know that I was clearly not welcome there. To this day I'm still unsure what exactly followed me home. Clearly, I was not welcomed to where I'd been. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and I would like to apologise to anyone from Lancaster who thought I did a terrible job at the accent. I wanted to give it a go, I probably absolutely butchered it, but there you go, you never know unless you try. Huge thanks as always to everyone for listening, it really does mean the world. Thank you for watching. I hope to still keep producing great content for you if you still listen. Anyway, I'd like to extend a huge extra thanks to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. They get extra stuff for signing up. Actually just released an extra mini video on there. If you want to see it, you don't have to. But thank you, seriously, all for listening. I'm going to go now, but if you want to watch other stuff, links are on screen now. Take care. Good night.